Going. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Paul Gilgee welcoming you all to the session today with Virgil Benoit, Professor Emeritus of French at the University of North Dakota. We're really honored to have you all aboard, and we're very especially honored to have Virgil Benoit with us. Now, some of us who are of Norwegian descent might wonder why in the world we are giving this emphasis to the French and the French Canadians. Well, they played a heck of a lot more role in the foundation of Rolette County and Botno County than did those old favored Norwegians of ours. So in terms of understanding that, and also understanding the role of the French Canadians in the Chippewa Indian Reservation and their connections between those, all very, very significant. Now, Virgil, I'm going to read from Virgil's biography because it's so significant. Dr. Benoit's research is on French heritage in North America. Throughout his career, he has studied, published, lectured, organized public events, and established 2 nonprofit organizations for the understanding of the cultures of France's 3 colonies in North America, which are Acadia, Louisiana, and Quebec. He is especially interested in serving a better understanding of the historical heritage, the cultural identity, and North American history, which of course we are too, through study, teaching, and community organizing. His work is widely organized. He is Professor Emeritus of French at the University of North Dakota, lives in the French Canadian community where he was born and grew up near the town of Red Lake Falls, Minnesota, some 40 miles east of Grand Forks. So Virgil, we're delighted to have you with us. Go to it.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and congratulations to all of you who are interested in following Paul in his leadership of this particular study. I think it's admirable that people are interested in the ways of others, and without that, I think we're just in for a tough ride. And so I admire you for your interest in others, and that we might be interested in you as well. Now, as I begin my talk, which will not be real long, I think it'll be about 15 minutes, I'd like to give you some topics that you might think about in terms of questions that you might want to frame or comments you might want to make about some topics. And this is kind of like what you might see in the margins of an article. If you want some enhancement of the topic that I will cover rapidly, perhaps, here are some of the topics that you might jot down and maybe want to ask some questions or some comments. I certainly can tell you and show you by illustration some folk songs that show the difference between the type of song that would be sung by the early fur trader and their descendants by the time you get to North Dakota, who are in different occupations in different places than the original descendants of the fur trade. I certainly am familiar with the way that Native Americans expressed the value of the land in the treaties when they were in negotiations with the US government for treaties. And I have abundant notes on that sort of thing and can give you a short example of some conversation regarding to property and land value on this planet. And then there's certainly a lot in the language that comes up in the people between what I call the country culture, the people away from the administrative centers that made decisions to actually move people across the country and enable them to do so. And there's a whole way of talking about what's valued in the country as opposed to what might be important in an epicenter of a government. There's often misunderstanding between the pronunciation of Métis, M-E-T-I-S, and Michif. On the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Reservation, if people talk about the mixed blood heritage, they will say Michif. They will not say Métis as is done in Canada. And I can explain that to you, why that difference exists. Also, it might be of some interest to you regarding the evolution of Michif identity or Métis identity, to have some contrast between what happened in the history of the Métis in Minnesota as opposed to those in North Dakota and along the Red River going north to Winnipeg. And if you have questions about a couple of books you might want to read about the topic in general that I'll be treating, I could give you a few titles. The name Bottineau as a family name, Bottineau, comes up a lot. And I've done extensive, well, I don't know, I've always been fascinated by Bottineau because he founded the town that is my postal address. I don't live in the town, I live 6 miles away from it, but he founded that town and in 1876, and he is really, if you're looking for somebody through whom all the movements of the social working and the network of kinship went through in the 1800s, it's Pierre Bottineau. So if you ask me to talk about him, if I put him in the talk, I would get sidetracked, and that's all you'd get. You wouldn't get the whole general overview I want to give you. If you're interested in the buffalo hunts and their influence, the impact is tremendous. The buffalo was a resource, and because of the existence of the buffalo, Eugene Robinson was considered North Dakota's historian, has written that it was through the buffalo that the Michifs offered North Dakota its first modern business. It really was their relationship with the buffalo and the selling and the freighting and all that of buffalo products was really a Métis creation. And then the notion of Métis versus Chippewa on the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Reservation today are all topics that interest me. So those are some of the areas that you might want to ask questions about. Now, you should get nothing short of a dramatization of what this history has been. Can you all hear me at this point?
Yes.
Yeah, you're
well.
fine.
Everything's okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Once again, thank you. I respect your interest very much. I wish you could influence the world order as much as possible with your outlook. North American fur trade along the Canadian and US border line is the title of this talk. This introduction to the fur trade will begin with comments on the routes, the people, and historic dates of that portion of the North American fur trade extending from Montreal to the Turtle Mountains of North Dakota. The routes that the fur trade would take in the area we are considering were numerous, crossing through a diverse geography inhabited by significant numbers of North Americans with values quite different from the Europeans they were encountering, beginning in the 1500s. Two of the main differences between North Americans and Europeans during all of their history of contacts from the 1500s through the 1800s centered on land and the form of governing and decision-making. Regarding land, Native Americans held they were only here to use the products of the land to sustain themselves and their people. They did not believe in channeling the land through negotiations into titles of ownership. As for the forming of social relationships leading to matters of governance and trade, Native peoples depended on kinship relationships. They relied on leaders who would speak on behalf of the community. Such leaders did not have authority compared to the power of royalty or even presidents of an American society that would be well established later in the 1800s. France and Great Britain were the two main European nations to invest early in North America. In the 1500s, they were fishing in the waters of Eastern Canada for cod. Later, this industry moved on shore to cure the much sought after food. Establishments on shore led to exploration for other sources of wealth. And that is how the fur trade began. The French were motivated by desire for wealth, as the British were. They didn't move out to the West as the French did. So let's go again at this. The French were motivated by desire for wealth, and that spirit was accompanied by interest to spread Christianity, and as well, to a high degree, the hope of finding a pathway across the continent to China, and thereby develop connections with the spice industry. It's strange that the place where the voyageurs, those who would paddle the canoes containing the merchandise that was to be carried west, would leave from a place right at Montreal called La Chine, China. The name still holds, and you can visit the place today. As the French moved the fur trade west, the communities were formed. As much as the French felt their civilization was to be spread over a new world, they did not have high numbers of would-be settlers. The geographical surface they explored and traded on extended from Nova Scotia, which was settled by Acadians of French origin. And then the other center was Quebec, and settlement from exploration moved west from there and then down south to New Orleans. This vast territory known as Louisiana on the southern portion, and New France on the north. In short, the French operated in a territory too vast to control by any government or any army. The French may have thought their civilization was superior, but only parts of it would survive in the country where they traded and explored. The notion that powers to control would come from a center would fade in the face of reality. The reality was that as the French moved west across the continent, a population of local character evolved in the pathway. A population having qualities that linked them to the fur trade, as well as qualities that they shared with their Native American kinship. The communities which evolved sprang up from the ground, so to speak. Their social representation certainly was strong. This form of extension was more cultural than political and was quite different from the concept of bringing government from afar. Government from afar, if I can diverse in two sentences, government from afar is kind of like a frog would leap on the surface. And at every stop of every leap, there would be a new influence, but it would represent what you could see at the surface and what was being transported. Whereas this other culture moved more underground, if I can say, like a gopher almost, or like a rhizome plant that sends its roots out and then they come up from the land, not from afar. Communities that rose up from the fur trade shared values from both European and Native American cultures to varying degree among individuals within the communities themselves. Communities known as Métis, or people known as Métis, did not form a nation. They were rather people who shared familiar circumstances of history and similar cultural heritage, such as language, food, music, religion, and patterns of social relations, which constitute a state of kinship rather than a form of European civilization. A visit to the Museum of Ojibwe culture housed in the old mission church in St. Ignace, Michigan, shows in many ways the history of shared and not so shared values among the French and Ojibwe of the fur trade era. And I'll repeat, the Museum to Ojibwe Culture in Ignace, Michigan, just 50 miles south of Sault Ste. Marie, ironically, is housed in an old church mission church. By the time of the fall of New France to the British in 1763, French fur trade and its influence had reached Western North Dakota through the explorations of La Vérendrye, L-A, capital V, E-N-D-R-Y-E, La Vérendrye, created quite a significant settlement in southwestern North Dakota. And the population known, let me see here, New France fur trade and its influence had reached western North Dakota. And the population known as Métis, who were spread across fur trade country, was in the several thousands. In 1789, 17 years or so after the fall, 16 years or so after the fall of New France in 1763. In 1789, Scots who were coming to Great Britain's newly acquired colony, Canada, and who possessed financial capability, founded the fur company they named the Northwest Fur Company. This company would operate from 1789 to 1821, when it was merged into the Hudson's Bay Company. Both companies wanted to benefit financially from the fur trade, but both companies were very different. First of all, from a human relations perspective, the Hudson Bay Company, founded in 1670 and located to the north of the indigenous population, and traded with the indigenous people, mixed at a minimum with the indigenous people with whom it traded. It was located handily to the north, and people had to take their goods up there if they wanted to trade with the company. The company did not go and trade directly in place. The mixing of traders and indigenous people was at a minimum with the Hudson Bay Company. The Hudson Bay Company would eventually overcome the Northwest Fur Company, but that would be on the level of finance, mainly. It was older than the Northwest Fur Company, and as such had greater financial resources. It was rather on the side of human relations and pure human contact that the Northwest Company would have the rich legacy it enjoys to this day. The Northwest Fur Company, located in Montreal, drew its assets from the wealth of its investors and the experience of its labor force. The investors were Scottish. The experienced force, or the labor force, was the French Canadian boys who would paddle the canoes, and the Métis, who were in place already across the country, and they were former trading partners along the way. They had very good assets, but a difficult terrain to traverse, carry the merchandise to the customer across several tribal nations, because nations, Native Americans, were situated by and large north and south. And the Hudson Bay Company would deal with people who just went straight north and didn't go east and west and didn't have to traverse. Even if they were Native Americans, they still had to respect the different territories of other indigenous people. The waterways over which trade goods had to be paddled and carried from Montreal to the west shores of Lake Superior were numerous and diverse. Once at Thunder Bay, west of Lake Superior, trade goods from Montreal had to be distributed further west. To assure the trade would survive from one year to the next, numerous former voyageurs who had paddled the large canoes from Montreal became winterers, living with the indigenous population. These winterers had a tendency to marry to a very high degree and simply stay and live their lives out in the country. By the time of the early 1800s, a population allied to the Northwest Company dominated the Red River Valley from Benoit to Winnipeg and points west. It is in the first quarter of the 1800s that the Métis of the Red River Valley, descendants of the fur trade, acquire their identity culturally strong enough to begin to grow politically. Culturally, they hunted away from home much of the time, yet returned to plots of land they identified with. And this returning to plots of land then means that their culture eventually is becoming associated with a land base. They shared unique language abilities, I should say, so that they could mix from one group of indigenous people to another in the area. And all of this served them well culturally. They adapted clothing and food to be appropriate to the region. They shared a common religion while remaining close to other Native American relatives. As time went on, the Métis of Red River developed a sense of identity, not only culturally, but politically. They were forced, as they felt, to consider strategies of defense in the face of newcomers in the land they would call more and more home. I must say that the American historian, whose name I forget, he was the historian of the West, and then his name will come to me soon, made the point long ago about this area that we're talking about up in the Red River area, Benoit, Winnipeg, going west, that history or settlement or the frontier lingered longer in that area than in anywhere else in North America. And so there was a culture of the country rather than one of institutions coming from the East and being imposed. The culture of the country was strong. And in 1816, a battle took place against the Orkney settlers who had recently arrived. Lord Selkirk had convinced the board of directors of the Hudson Bay Company to let him purchase a large tract of land within the area that the Hudson Bay had taken on as its trading territory. And he had said that this would assure a place for the Scottish to migrate because they were being removed from their land by certain rural policies in Scotland that were removing the local people from the land they had lived on for so long. And they were suffering tremendously through poverty and famine. And Lord Selkirk acquired a large area of the Hudson Bay Company, and he placed a lot of these people, and some of them from Orkney, in areas very close to the Métis people. And the Métis people of the area helped them in the hunt the first years, but then after a couple of years, they got going, and then they allied themselves with the Hudson Bay Company, which would do what it could to slow down the operations of the Northwest Fur Company. So that in 1816, the battle that we call the Battle of the Oaks, Seven Oaks, Battle of Seven Oaks, that's the title in English. And in French, it comes out to be the Battle of the Frog Plain. And the Métis met at that point some Northwest for some Hudson Bay people and just simply demolished them. And it might come up why, but you couldn't beat a Métis who had arrived at the spot where the pony now was. Canoe was gone, the pony was in. They could hunt on pony, the buffalo, the other game, and they had a gun from earlier trade practices. You couldn't beat them. They were fabulously associated and tied with the country. Well, anyway, they demolished that particular kind of thing, and it became part of their identity that they could defend their area. They had viewed the Orkney people as intruders on the side of the Hudson Bay Company. The Métis, masters of both the gun, the pony, and the lay of the land, came out victorious. A new song of victory was even written by who became a kind of a national poet. This national hymn was composed with new hope and affirmation. And it is through such actions that the Métis of the Red River became one of the strongest Métis groups in North America. The challenges they met affirmed their identity. So they came out of the Battle of 1816, not only with a song, but a flag. The pony was strong, and so were they. After 1821, when the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company merged, the common traders of the Northwest Company, and there I say the common traders, those who had extensive stocks in the Northwest Company didn't seem to suffer. They went on, and as it was said, little streams made big rivers, and along big rivers, there were canoes that brought supplies to the company. So the stockholders made it okay, but the common trapper and trader for the Northwest Company was out of work. And it was harder to get supplies for their daily lives because they weren't considered great friends of the posts of the Northwest Company. Strategies for survival of ways and convictions that seem to maybe be in fashion and maybe could make it were now much weaker than before for the Métis. For some 30 years, from about the 1840s to the 1870s, or 40s to the 70s, the Métis developed a strong right turn in their identity because of their work, which became attached to the freighting of material goods by ox cart from Old St. Joseph near Walhalla today to the cities of St. Paul and then to Winnipeg, where they ironically supplied the Hudson Bay Company with the pemmican needed for longer voyages to the Athabasca, for example, where the voyagers they had would not hunt, but paddle. And they needed this compressed food known as pemmican to make the trip. They carried it with them, and the Métis west of Pembina in the area of Walhalla supplied them with what they needed in that regard. During the 1860s, new efforts of a political nature were tried, affirmations. The Hudson Bay Company said it was going to put up all of its holdings for sale, and they were going to sell it by the 1850s. The vying for power, the vying to purchase that vast holding the Hudson Bay Company had in Middle America was stressful on the whole area. St. Paul people sent up lawyers and bargainers to see if they could convince the local people that they would take the side of the Americans and not the Canadians or the British. The Métis themselves lobbied hard. They were the major population. They wanted a role in the new politics that would come from afar rather than from the country itself. And the politics were interesting and complex, and the Métis lost. And such books as Two Empires, which show how the American Empire of the United States and the British Empire would continue to go, but the people of the country didn't necessarily have much more than their country culture. You had to have a nation to negotiate. During the 1860s, these new efforts especially came to a head in 1870 when Manitoba was made a province, and the Métis descendants of the fur trade were scattered politically. They would move to the west because Saskatchewan wasn't yet a province, and they hoped that they could start over there. And many of them who had established themselves along with French Canadians in North Dakota left for Saskatchewan because the people of Canada, such as missionaries, the Church of North Dakota, the Catholic Church of North Dakota, was controlled out of Quebec. And they worked through St. Boniface, part of Winnipeg today, to supply missionaries to North Dakota. And some of those missionaries from Canada started to preach in communities like Olga, even way out here in Minnesota, that the people who were there, who were speaking French, who were old French Canadian settlers or Métis people living among the French Canadians, ought to go back to Canada because there they'd have their language. And you couldn't trust the Americans to support French as a language in a country with so many languages. But in Canada, French had a status. And many of them moved to the extent that the Bishop of Fargo, that was the only bishop of North Dakota, wrote a severe letter to all of the pastors in North Dakota of Catholic churches saying that if you have any more of this talk going on, you will directly hear from me and suffer the consequences. No more talk about going back to Canada. They were destroying the parishes in North Dakota in many places. That's just a bit of an insight as to some of the comings and goings here as to what identity meant. It was language, it was food, it was culture, it was kinship. And you lived between what was becoming a stronger and stronger city directed regiment of structuring society rather than what would emerge locally. What happens then? Fur trading, Canadian fur trading fathers, usually we consider that it was the father's side that initiated the mixing of the races, and the mother was usually a native woman chosen. So we have this image when we talk often that a lot of the Michif people of Turtle Mountains today will say, I respect both of my parents, my mother and my father. And that really means that they respect both cultures. The European background that they say came from their fathers initially, and the Native American background that they say comes from their mother. So that's what they say if you hear them say, we respect both of us. And that is an argument for a Michif person towards someone who would maybe be Michif in some ways, but they say they're Chippewa. And the Michif person will say, I respect both my parents' backgrounds. And it's just hard to, to come back on that one because everybody would say, yeah, well, I do too. And so these backgrounds were not just limited then to French Canadians and Indigenous mothers. As time went on, you could see there was strong Scottish influence because the Scots were supplying the funding to the fur trade, and a lot of the personnel that was Scottish came west, and so Scottish influences entered into the traditions of families and the makeup of families. The Irish tradition, when you look at how the Irish tried to undermine the bid for the British, the British bid for the Northwest Company territory, they sent up Fenians, into Winnipeg who would lobby in favor of the Métis because they wanted to undermine the British position. So you get an Irish influence coming in, and then the American culture influence. So in the songs that we have and in the music we have, at this point, you're no longer dealing with a very limited kind of folklore language, which was initially the French of the voyageurs. But all of a sudden you have a Red River Valley culture of much mixing, and the value of what you people are doing. And I have seen you on the Turtle Mountain and what you do in your relationships. When you create, when you give value to those that you are meeting, they will never forget you. And they will become your friends insofar as you both come to understand each other. I don't know how many Métis, Michifs, or Chippewa sold you flutes because of your activities and movements in there. And in fact, the last time I took a group of students there about 10 years ago, it was a Norwegian woman who took in 2 of my students on the reservation. Never undermine in the creation of culture, relationship based on culture, the meeting of people with whom you take value, or from whom you take value. Today, elements of culture and politics continue in North Dakota, especially in the north, elements of culture from the fur trade and the politics that we've begun to put forth. Are very apparent, especially in northeastern region of the state, among those who consider they are Michif rather than Chippewa. But I just respect what somebody wants to call themselves and draw on explanations of who they are by looking at the history and seeing the diverse history. And in some ways, you can say, you maybe have a French Canadian name, but you got to straighten that out at some point. You're not maybe inherently French Canadian. You come from a long time. I've come from people who existed a long time before the French Canadians came on the scene. I don't know what to say. You're basically a human being. And you're responsible for identifying who you are to some extent. But a lot of people have French Canadian names, and they're Chippewa. And how do you deal with that?
Do you think, Virgil, that we should turn to questions from people pretty soon?
I think you see that is, I'm going to read my last paragraph is where I was. Today, elements of culture and politics continue in North Dakota, especially in the northeastern region. And it is sure that both traditions, Chippewa and Michif, have culture, and cultures live side by side today with politics of nationhood. National efforts of a true political nature have given, with hard work, for example, the wonderful Turtle Mountain Community College, located just outside of Belcourt on the reservation. Strategies for education had to be followed, and a college was created. But it was because you had an Indian nation that was dealing with the US nation that you got support, not because you were a Métis culture. I can't get a college over here because I'm French Canadian. That's an ethnic group, and we don't deal in that way. And that's the way it worked. The US government dealt with Native American nations, and the Métis were a culture and not a nation. In Canada, they have convinced themselves and others since 1972 that they are a nation. So they do qualify as an indigenous nation, indigenous people. What we can say here is, so history compels us to belong to a nation in order to make certain achievements as a nation. Yet culture is what sustains us to a very high degree. I'm ready for questions.
Okay, well,
we can have comments.
I must say to you, and Erin Kane has just said, so interesting. Thank you, Virgil. Erin Kane is an unusual person here. Not only is she a wonderful lady, Erin's grandfather, full-blooded Norwegian, married a full-blooded French woman. And so, Erin, I think because of your family connections, you ought to ask the first question.
Gosh, I don't know what to ask. was just fascinating. I'm just taking it all in. Thank you, Virgil. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
Okay. Not another question. Who would like to just come out with your questions?
I have a question, I guess. What period of time was there an actual fur trading industry in the Pembina area and in the Turtle Mountain area?
Yeah, fur trading in its heaviest extent could move along quite quickly, but in a smaller degree, it lasts for a long time. I can remember as a kid, we had a lot of people still trapping animals and trading them. But it was to a very small degree. It wasn't a big industrial kind of business. Industrially speaking, Pembina was reached in about 1805 is when the fur trading companies began to build structures to which people could come and trade. In 1805, then the trade was strong. Both fur companies had sufficient business, but by 1821, the fur trading was going down in terms of the numbers of animals you could get easily, and they headed to the north. So you've got about a 40-year period, and that's the period that probably belonged to a high degree to the American Fur Company. So the 1780s to 1820, you have a pretty good business, but especially from 1800 to 1820 is the area that you're talking about.
That'd be both in the Pembina area and Turtle Mountain.
Yes, yeah. There are rivers that flow in such ways towards the Red River that the people moved along those rivers and took and set up posts, especially on the Red River. And those posts were connecting points or like docks that would be joined together to make a line on which furs were make a line by which or over which canoes traversed in the spring with the trade goods that would go to Thunder Bay. Yeah, that's your main period, I'm quite sure.
Thank you.
Bernie Harrison. Bernie, you have a lot of family members in Bottineau County. Do you have a question you'd like to raise?
Yeah, kind of a two-part question. You spoke a lot about the Métis or Miche, if I have the words pronounced right. And then you refer to the Turtle Mountain natives. So the first part of the question is, would the natives in the Turtle Mountain area, would they be under this Métis umbrella, or is Chippewa something different? What groups would have been in those Turtle Mountain, the people focused in the Turtle Mountain area?
Yeah, well, a lot of the people, if not most of them, maybe a small contingent, did not move or get moved from Pembina to the Turtle Mountains where the reservation is. The Michif people, the Métis people of Pembina, lived at Pembina for a good 60 years. See,
where's Pembina?
Pembina?
Where's Pembina?
Okay. Pembina is right in the corner, the northeast corner of North Dakota, right at the border to Canada, and right on the border of Minnesota. And the Michif people lived there. They began to gather there as the fur trade got there in 1800. Some people say 1805. They noticed certain people by records were there. And then they stayed there. They were there at the time of the Treaty of 1863, which ceded the land, all the land that was drained by virtue of the Red River on both sides of Minnesota and North Dakota in that area. So it's a vast territory, millions of acres. And the Pembina people, the Chippewa band of Pembina people, among whom were living the Michif, came to the treaty negotiations of 1863, as did the Red Lake band of Chippewa. There were two bands. So your question is just what was the relationship between those two? There were Chippewa who stayed Chippewa and did not intermarry into European groups. And there were Métis who kept being Métis and sometimes marrying over into the Chippewa group and sometimes over into one of the other races or nation or ethnic groups. How am I doing in answering your question? Would you refine it again?
Well, it just was what the name would be for the natives that were in that Bottineau area. And I think you more or less answered it. And the second part of the question was,
if I can say this,
go ahead.
if you hear the word Michif spoken by the people of Turtle Mountains, it's because they're using the old pronunciation for Métis. And Métis is preferred because it's spelled M-E-T-I-S. And as people began to read French more and more, they said that Métis, okay? But that was pronounced before people were reading as Michif. And it doesn't matter how it was spelled, that was the way it was pronounced. And the people of Turtle Mountain have always pronounced who they are as Michifs, using the old history. In a sense, if they took on Métis, it would be as if they were attached to the Canadian politics of identity, saying today we are Métis, and however you pronounce that in the past, we are Métis.
When I
But
was
when you say
growing up,
Michif, you're really relating to the old traditions that you had, and you're not moving the politics of Métis forward on the international level.
you know, it's tragic, as you mentioned this, Virgil. My uncles who grew up and lived on a farm barely 7 miles south of the border of the reservation, they never used the word Métis. They used another derogatory word, always used it, which was breed, the breeds. They were always talking about the breeds.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I don't, in the things that we come to despise, often is hidden a lack to want to understand how complex it could be. And I'll add to a sense of what the complexity is by saying the following. I think when you consider why people of Norwegian background settled, or Norwegians came directly and settled close to the reservation, is because in the 1880s, or in the years that followed the initial tracing of the territory that would be the reservation, it was discovered or felt more and more that there were a number of people on the reservation who shouldn't be there. And this is something that is quite explainable, because it was felt that if you were Native American, you should go to a reservation. If that's what you chose, you had the right to be on a reservation. If you were a Métis and you claimed you could go and had ties to the reservation, you could do that. But if you showed that you were a civilized Métis, you were misplaced if you were on a reservation, and you should not be counted then for the size of the land base the reservation would take. Now, civilized to me is not to be civilized or not civilized to me is just neutral. If you're civilized, you have a particular sense of or you're living by a particular sense of how one lives in the kinds of civilizations we have. And the orders usually come from the capital of some place and so on and so forth. if you're not civilized, you may very well be one of those persons who lived for a long time in the area of Benoit and so forth, that what we call the Benoit district, that was not a part of the organizing of a government, similar to the other ways governments and states had been organized as you came from the east west. And so being uncivilized means you were more controlled by a country culture, a local culture, and you had habits and you had regulations, and you weren't crazy. It was very strictly moderated. And so culture, or civilized or non-civilized, to me simply means there's different ways of operating. And we understand that, I think. But this was strong in this period we're talking about.
Very good.
And all right.
Let's see if
And
we
so
can move
what
on.
happened then is, once the government was convinced that there really were so many immigrants coming in that there was a need for land, and then we had the Civil War, which guaranteed to a lot of soldiers that they could have land in the area. The land was going after a while quite quickly, and eventually we were becoming short of new homestead spots. And so they looked seriously into the nature of the population of the Turtle Mountain Reservation, and they made it smaller, saying, look, we got too many people there who are civilized. They're not living as Native Americans. They're living as other kinds of people. No, they should go and be somewhere else. So the Métis fell through a safety net. They were culturally something, but they didn't have a nation to cling to. And some people said they can't be citizens of something they're not part of culturally.
Very good. We
So
have,
the Norwegians took advantage of that opening of extra land when the territory of the reservation was made smaller. And so did the French Canadians, who had settled earlier, but now were tight on land in the area of Fargo and other places. And they went up to the Turtle Mountains. So a lot of French Canadians you get over there are people who were doing the same thing the Norwegians were doing. They were seeing there were new announcements for new land available, and they went.
okay, thank you.
Those two groups of
Guilty.
people have a lot in common.
Okay, Frederica, do you know, would Chuck like a question? Chuck always has a good question to raise. Might he have one today? Frederica's on mute. Okay, we wait for that.
I have a question, Paul.
Yeah, Mike's got a question. A question,
Well, I'm just-
not a speech, a question, Mike.
Yes, Paul.
Uh,
I'm just, we hear about the Turtle Mountain Reservation, and the name echoes the region of mountains that extended across North Dakota into Canada. And I'm just wondering about the significance of that area geologically as a place, a gathering place. Was it significant in that kind of way among the people who were moving across the top of the country, like in that time?
Yeah. Is it you're waiting? Is it this coming to me now? I don't know. Paul, can you intervene?
What's the problem right now?
We're getting an.
I don't know what the problem is. It seems like we've got a question, and we've got some delay in what's being said. I don't know if you can clear that.
Okay, I've just muted everybody. So now go ahead and for Virgil, go ahead and chat. I've muted everybody else. So now you can unmute yourself and respond. Go ahead, Virgil. You can unmute yourself. I just to get rid of the sound problem.
Okay. Am I okay now?
Yeah, you're good now.
I think what you want to do, who is a friend of yours now who asked that question about the significance of Turtle and Turtle Mountain?
I think that was Mike Oyseth was asking.
Okay, Mike. I think, Mike, you want to bring that up with some Turtle Mountain people who know the history and legend, or history of the legend of the turtle. I think this starts in the Great Lakes, and it is the turtle that keeps everything on, afloat, if you would, and there it is the legend of the turtle that is carried to the reservation, and the mountains of the area are called the Turtle Mountains. They're not big high mountains, but they're nice, beautiful, smaller kinds of big hills. And the name comes from the legend of the turtle and its significance in the cultural history and folklore of the Chippewa.
Very good. Virgil, you were listing the questions in advance. You mentioned the whole matter of the buffalo hunt. In the 1800s, were there still millions of buffalo roaming Dakota, for example? And how quickly did they get knocked off, and how close were they to the Turtle Mountain and to Pembina?
Yeah. Well, in terms of where Walhalla is, you get, as you go west across the state of North Dakota, you'll come to Walhalla at about 30 miles west of Pembina, always close to the border. And then in another 50 miles or so, you'll come to the Turtle Mountains going west. Now, the buffalo hunt became extremely important to the Métis, who established the processing of buffalo meat into what is called pemmican. The pemmican was sold in 90-pound bundles that were wrapped in the hide of a buffalo and sealed. And this was all done very, very skillfully, so that the pemmican would keep. It would be dried and sealed with buffalo tallow within the hide of a bull buffalo that could contain, when wrapped, 90 pounds of pemmican. These were transported in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bundles by ox cart by the Métis of Old St. Joseph, which was next to what Walhalla was to be when it would come in the 1870s. But Old St. Joseph was established about 1840, and it had people who then eventually went on the buffalo hunt to make this pemmican, which became a tremendous business. That was a modern business. That's what the North Dakota historian Robinson said it was the first North Dakota real modern business. And it involved producing a product off of the resource, after one of the resources of the land, which was the buffalo, and freighting it, selling it and freighting it. And these carts could carry up to 500 pounds of merchandise, these two-wheeled ox carts or Red River carts. And as many of them left the post of Antoine Gingras at Old St. Joseph, who managed the whole thing, as many as 1,500 carts could leave in late May for St. Paul. And this was at its heaviest in the 1850s. It started in the 1840s. Between the 1850s and the 1860s, it was strong. It was a big, big cultural thing that added to the identity of the Michif people as being prairie people. The buffalo was numerous. They had no problems. Later on, the buffalo suffered from being overhunted, but there was also a national US policy that said if we eliminate the buffalo, we're going to make it harder for Native Americans to live out in the vast expanses of the country, and it'll be easier to gather them up. They'll be forced to, take on other ways in other places. And so eliminating the buffalo also became part of an American policy, which you can study. And that is the era that killed so many buffalo, leaving the bones on the prairie, that later on settlers, to make their first little income of actual cash, they would pick those bones up from the prairie and take them to the train depot, and they would be loaded up and top and taken to fertilizer plants where they were made a fertilizer.
Thank you. Next question. Mike, you have another question? Oiseth, you have another question?
No questions from Billings. Thank you.
Frederica, do you have one?
No, thank you. Very interesting.
You got any question, Frederica, about for you or Chuck?
No, thank you very much.
Okay,
I had a second part of my question.
go ahead.
Yeah, that is what could generally be said of, you know, the Native American influence and so forth in Bottineau. Would that reach as Rolette, which is about 30 plus miles, almost 40 miles south and east? A lot of people here, I think, have maybe identify more with that area.
Yeah, I once asked somebody who knew the history of Bottineau, the town named Bottineau, why it took that name. And he said, well, we were all a bunch of settlers. They were all a bunch of settlers who were coming in recently. And they wanted to be sure that the local people knew that they didn't mean to be hostile. They were going to take the name of one of their own. And so I've never known this town of Bottineau as being very French Canadian or very, very Michif or Chippewa. They simply took the name because they wanted to express some knowledge of a local boy. And when I appeared there to give the inaugural address to a statue of Pierre Bottineau, which is a life-size statue, and it's in copper, and it's an artist put a lot of effort into making it. I have to say, although I've never said it very much, that I'm rather disappointed that it put a bunch of traps hanging from Bottineau's waist as if he was a trapper. Pierre Bottineau, after whom the city of Bottineau is named, was not extensively a trapper. I know he knew how to set a trapper, but he was an expedition guide. And his job was quite different. It was not the old traditional trapper. It was the intermediary stage of activities that the Métis played as areas went from territories to state. The mixed blood people, the Michif people, could play a very important role. You know that if you're going someplace you don't know the language, you take along a guide who's been there and knows the language. That's what the Michif people offered. And they were really, really significant in the transitionary period as guides. Hell, they had barges on rivers because they knew how to do that. They operated living quarters and all kinds of things, where they could gather in the resources of the area to help people who were coming through. But once the people coming through got established, it was hard to get a job as a Michif.
A question from our Norwegian friend here, Kjell Nodland in Stavanger, Norway. Do you have a question? He's muted.
Yes. Hello.
Anybody else? Okay, Kjell, do you have a question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Two questions. Can you compare the Métis people with the Cajun people in Louisiana? Is that more or less the same logic or development?
Yeah. Well, the Cajun people, there's a lot in the name. So let's start with why you get the name Cajun. The Louisiana people who are called Cajuns really came from Acadia, which was one of the very early settlements of the French in the New World. That's the area that's now Nova Scotia, because in the 1750s, the British conquered Acadia, and they renamed it Nova Scotia. And they conquered it because they were on their way to conquering Quebec. And to do that from New England with your ships, you had to go by Acadia or Nova Scotia. And they didn't want those people interfering with what they wanted to do, because by and large, the Acadians had said they were neutral. The Acadians were eventually expelled because they were seen as troublemakers in the war between the British and the French. And They were invaded and removed by boat unless they fled. Eventually, many of them fled to Louisiana because they said, well, that's French territory, let's give it a try. And they got down there. And from there being Acadians, I'll say it in French, because French speakers, Acadiens, and pronounced in the old way, Acadien, which you get a and all this, like you get from Métis, you get Michif, all this sound stuff, which is fun, but which not everybody follows. But anyway, they had been Acadien, and now that was shortened and they became Cajun or Cajuns. So much of the tradition of the Louisiana Cajuns comes from Acadia, the old French thing, their folklore, their songs, so much the music, the inspiration, their determination to make it when they get flooded every year with the tides and stuff. The old Cajuns were seaboarder people, and they knew how to deal with the water coming in on them all the time, and going back and forth. And they did well. But when they got down to Louisiana, they became Cajuns. And today they have a spirit of connection with their old folklore. Their music has a different pattern than the Michif music, which is more influenced by Scottish, Irish, American, and French Canadian traditions. The Cajuns have an influence that comes from Acadia. And if you hear the two musics, I mean, you just can't say they're the same. But the Cajun music attracts the Michif people who use the fiddle. If somebody says they're Michif, they've got to know what the fiddle does, because that was the instrument of the French Canadians. And but if they use a drum, well, then it's more Chippewa. So our instruments of expression, music, are quite different. And
you have a second question, Shell?
So we have some Michif people who say, they want to play some Cajun tunes because they identify that way with the music.
Shell, your second question?
Hello?
Yes.
Yes. When I learned that Roulette was a kind of mixed town between Norwegians, Scandinavians, and French. The French living there, together with the Norwegians, were they kind of mestizo people, or were they French people moving from other parts of the state?
That's interesting. You'd have to almost do a survey to see where people stand. And I'll bet you what they would say would vary from one generation to the other if you could go back and get the truth, so to speak. Because a lot of people would want to say, oh, we fit in, so we're Michif. A lot of French Canadians will do that around here. They say, oh, there's none of us that doesn't have Indian blood. You know what I mean? And they're proud of that, and act around. But when it comes to get land, we don't land, so we're French Canadian. Because of identity, toil and things like that, some will say we were Michif. Yeah, we get along with everybody. Michif, we go to the reservation, and go to the casino, and we do this on the reservation. And then on the other hand, they'll say, well, no, we got this big tractor and we cultivate, thousands of acres and stuff. And you look at them and say, well, then you're something else, So you got to look at the values and see who they want to get along with and what that means to them in terms of how they tell their story of who they are. And so I can tell you, there's a lot of French Canadians around here who claim that they were Michif, and that they could, understand those things, and what we did wasn't wrong because we did it and we were half Native American. And so why not, Well, baloney. They didn't have one drop of anything in them that was indigenous. And so, but what do they want to be? And what do they think they are? And how do they tell their story is really what interests me.
Very good.
Because that's where the truth of what you want to call them eventually, and what you think about who they want to think about as themselves really lies. And if we take people that we want them to be different in what they say, then we're going to be at odds with them right away. So I would say that in the county that you just mentioned, there's very few. There's some people who are Métis, but Métis can be just a word. What is it that you practice and how do you live? That's what it is. Hell, I could go to Norway, and if I knew anything about the language and the people and everything else, and I come to love it, I would be a contributing Norwegian to the Norwegian culture. And hold me away from that, I would say, what the hell? You think I'm not a human being and that I can't do things you're doing? I can lift my load and I can make this country what you want it and what we all want it to be. I don't have to be anybody's name. I have to be a servant of what's good and decent for building relationships. And when some people say they're such and such, ask them what that means to them to be that.
You folks here ought to be able to tell that Virgil is really a dear, dear individual who looks to people, not to anything but who they are. And it's just wonderful to hear your comments. Virgil, I just have to ask these folks one more time. Andy or Ann or Bernie or Frederica, Chell, Mike, Randy, anybody want to have one last question before we say goodbye? It's been on for a long time. I just want to say again, thank you. Let's see, anybody else want to say a special tribute to Virgil Benoit?
Hey, we had a question. We have
Okay.
One relative on Randy's grandfather's side, that was one of the daughters of the king that they brought over to Quebec.
Sure.
Do you know anything about that?
Well, if it's the first time somebody hears you say that, you might think, well, golly, the king must have had a lot of daughters. And how did that happen? It's a term that's used to indicate those young women whom the king would give a dowry if they left to settle in New France, where they had to take a husband within, I don't know, 6 months or something like that, and start to raise a family. And that was an effort to raise the settlers' population. People didn't want to move out of France. They didn't for various reasons. I don't know. It's not because it was an easy life. I don't know. They just didn't want to move. And so France always had a problem with demographics. And some people will tell you, oh, the French were kind to the Native Americans, and that's why they've intermarried, and that's why they got along so well, and that's why all these French names are over here on the Turtle Mountains and all that stuff. Oh, I think it's because they didn't have a population to do differently other than intermarry. And they did that a lot. And that sometimes the Catholic Church would regulate and influence marriage a lot. Who you married with and what you did afterwards and so on and so forth. Encouraged marriages like that because he said, well, they'll become our culture and then they'll be like us. And then, we'll have more people on our side. And it turned out it wasn't that way. Some of the fellows really liked living out in the way in the country, not in the little villages that were French Canadian. And so the French Canadians said, well, we're losing too much of our population and we're losing our feeling for what it means to be French. And then you get that argument that is very much extends into our relationship with France today is often French people come and they don't recognize that we French Canadians.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else have one final question? If not, we'll have to call it thing. Well, we'll be recording this. You'll be able to get the recording and play it back. And by the way, those of you, when you follow the recording, if you're careful with YouTube, you should be able to get closed captioning as well. So the words are also printed when you're doing the playback. So thank you, Virgil. Thank you so much on behalf of the group for a terrific afternoon. And we'll say goodbye. We'll be on another month with Roald Lund, who's going to talk about agriculture in the Pioneer area and how it compares with today. So are we through? Are we through, Virgil? Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Best wishes to all of you. Goodbye.